All right, and now so we'll go ahead and get started. This is a Zoom meeting. We are asking that everybody stay muted during the duration of this meeting as we want to get through all of this amazing content for you all. We will be recording this and uploading it so that way those who would like to reiterate these items can do so with the help and the assistance of the recording from this session. So we're really excited to see you all. So just for a quick webinar norm for this meeting, we are asking that you guys put all of your questions in the chat. And when you put your question in the chat, we're also asking that you include your name and your email address. And those who would like those responses to the questions, our little FAQ that we'll be composing for you all, we're asking that you put your name and email in the chat, and we will get those responses sent out as quickly as possible. We are not asking you this to be rude. We're just asking so that way we can make sure we give you the best answer possible, as that may include an answer from multiple teams. So if you can, put your questions in the chat along with your email address and name, and we'll be sure to answer your questions as soon as possible. And we're excited to see you guys. I know I said this before, but one more time, because there are people who have just come into the meeting. This is the exact same presentation that we did earlier this week. So if you saw us earlier this week, you're going to get the same exact information, but we are excited to welcome you to the Diverse Learners Literacy Screening Guidance for K-3 middle of the year 2023-2024 administration. As we go through this presentation, our objectives are as follows. We want you to understand, why is it important to administer a literacy screener? When is DIBELS 8 administered, and when are scores reported? Who is assessed, and also how are diverse learners included in the screening. And the purpose of our literacy screener is so that way we can know, like, why are we administering this screener? What is a universal screener? What are the benefits to early intervention? And then what is this Earl Michael Willis Early Learning Literacy Act 520? What is this act? How does this pertain to us? And it's very important that we get to that. So let's start with defining what a universal screener is. So universal screening results should identify those students who are potentially at risk for reading failure, including those who may have developmental reading disabilities. Data from universal screenings should be used to make informed decisions about evidence-based interventions and the progress monitoring that should follow. Interventions should address the needs of the students as identified by the screening process. Progress monitoring is then done to determine if progress is adequate or if more or different interventions are required. So, importance of early intervention or intervening early. Why should we do this early? Well, reading delays identified prior to K-2 reduces the risk of future, I'm trying to let people in at the same time, reduces the risk of future reading problems for students with disabilities or just students in general. And early identification before grade 3 can reduce the amount of intervention needed to make sufficient gains. Lastly, early interventions can possibly impact long-term achievements. So we want to make sure we're identifying as early as possible. Earl Michael Willis Early Literacy Act. So as you've likely heard and reviewed, Act 520 was updated to include the development of literacy programs for all students in grades K through 3rd, including those students with disabilities. The Act indicates a literacy screener will be selected to access all public, will be selected to assess all public school students in K through 3rd grade. And that screener should assess phonological awareness, phonics, decoding, fluency, and reading comprehension. These are the minimum skills that should be measured for each student. The purpose of the literacy screener is to identify students who are reading below their grade level and will assist with the identification of students needing additional assessments, such as those students with characteristics of dyslexia. Screenings are in full force currently for our public schools, as the Act indicates that the screenings must take place within the first 30 days. And then they should be screened again in the middle of the year and lastly at the end of the year. The literacy screener is provided as it measures each grade band for a specific skill set. The slide shows you the skills that will be measured for each grade level. It is beneficial to remember that students with disabilities are not always considered a Tier 3 intervention. They don't always need Tier 3 intervention supports. The screening data can be used to determine the assistance needed to support students with disabilities. This data should also inform the professional development needs for best instructional practices. For example, this data may reveal that there are some additional needs for accommodations training, not just that the student needs additional accommodations, but that maybe the teachers and staff members need additional professional development supports to learn about making these accommodations for students. And so we're going to get into the timelines, and I will gladly turn it over to Mrs. Charlene Long.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Heron. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to start us off by talking about a few deadlines we have for reporting results from the DIBELS assessment. As Dr. Heron said, within the first 30 days of school, at the beginning of the year, DIBELS Universal Screener was administered to all students, and that composite score was reported to the department. And then 30 days after that first administration, reports were compiled with the number and percentage of students with composite scores that fell below, those that had scores on level, and those that fell above level, and the number of students who were identified for referral for gifted evaluations, as well as the number of students who required targeted literacy intervention. And this report was submitted to each public school governing authority, to each public school, and then to each K-3 teacher. Within the first 90 days of school, and again by June 1st, the beginning, middle, and end of the year results are broken down by school, school system, and state as a whole. And this report is shared with the Senate and House Commissions on Education. This is a critical step. As we know, families play an essential role in the literacy development of children. Strong family literacy engagement is active involvement in authentic communication, building meaningful relationships, and fostering a learning community among school leaders, teachers, families, and students. As part of this open line of communication, Bulletin 741 sets forth a requirement that when a student's scores fall below level benchmarks, families are to be notified within 15 days, and a reading improvement plan is created in collaboration with the parents within 30 days. The department's literacy team has built out a family literacy engagement library that provides resources for families as well as grab-and-go activities. The literacy division has also provided parent reporting forms for each grade level. The reporting forms are linked here for quick access, and these forms provide families with an explanation of scores, a description of interventions, and then a description of interventions that are provided at home as well as at school. And the principal, teacher, and parents sign this form as they work together to work on these goals for the student. For diverse learners, this provides an opportunity for our general education teachers to collaborate with special education teachers on designing IEP goals to address the needs of diverse learners. In this section, we'll discuss who will be assessed using the K-3 literacy screener. IDEA sets the expectations regarding students with disabilities and their participation in state and district assessments. ESSA and IDEA highlight the need to ensure that all children with disabilities are included in all general, state, and district-wide assessment programs, with appropriate accommodations and alternate assessments if necessary, as indicated on their respective IEPs. Louisiana Bulletin 1706 reiterates IDEA's stance through the Children with Exceptionalities Act, and it states essentially the same thing. All students with disabilities are included in all assessment programs with appropriate accommodations and alternate assessments as needed. Louisiana, the law makes it clear that this isn't if students with disabilities will participate in assessments. So sorry for that. So IEP teams are charged with determining how they will participate, not if they will participate. Students with disabilities can participate in assessments in one of three ways. They can participate in assessments in the same way as other students participate in assessments with accommodations, or they may participate in alternate assessments if criteria is met on the K-2 alternate assessment participation decision-making tool, or the 3 through 12 alternate assessment participation criteria is met. It's especially important to note that the alternate assessment participation is typically 1% of the population. Students with the most significant cognitive disabilities may meet criteria to participate in an alternate assessment. However, decision-making, the tool should be utilized to ensure that the decisions are not made solely based upon instructional setting or disability classification. It's imperative that professionals administering assessments to students with disabilities receive the proper training on how to most accurately provide testing accommodations. To support the assessment of diverse learners, school systems should consider providing trainings on how to include students with disabilities in academic assessments, develop trainings and guides to increase understanding of assessment results, and provide support to educators on how to use assessment data to identify needed interventions. These trainings will build the capacity of educators, and school system trainings can empower IEP teams by providing them with proper training and information to confidently make participation, accessibility, and accommodation decisions, as well as PD opportunities focused on the proper administration of accommodations to maintain the reliability and validity of assessments. Support and direction on the analysis, interpretation, and application of assessment data that's required to plan for and provide effective targeted interventions, as well as trainings on the identification of additional assessments that may be needed to provide that additional diagnostic information to target interventions. The implementation of high fidelity interventions that result in improved student outcomes is also another possible topic to build educator capacity. Additional resources are available at the end of this webinar. Let's discuss how diverse learners can be included in the literacy screener while still meeting their individual needs. According to National Center on Educational Outcomes, the universal design for learning is based on brain science and the understanding that learners have their individual profiles for how they best engage with, receive, and communicate new learning to others. UDL has also been a useful concept for enhancing inclusion of students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities in education systems because it highlights the need to provide students multiple pathways toward learning outcomes. Universal design applies to assessments as well. The National Center for Outcomes reports accessibility is important because it provides all students with an opportunity to show what they know and can do. And it improves the overall fairness of an assessment for all students, including students with disabilities, English learners, as well as English learners with disabilities. Universally designed assessments may also reduce the need for testing accommodations, but there may always be a need for accommodations for some students. UDL assessments anticipate the need for one or more accommodations based on an individual student's needs and do not make it challenging to use those accommodations. Universally designed assessments do not change the standards measured by assessments. Students may use different pathways to receive and communicate that knowledge, but the standards remain high for all students. Universally designed assessments also should improve the validity, reliability, and fairness of assessments for all students, including, but not limited to, students with disabilities. Although many students with disabilities can be screened in the same way as their peers without disabilities, some students may have needs that should be considered when administering and analyzing the early literacy assessment. National Center on Educational Outcomes states special education directors have an important role to play in ensuring that students with disabilities are provided accessible assessments and that appropriate decisions are made about the participation of students with disabilities in these assessments. As a brief review for you all, we all know certainly the definition of accommodation, but just to review to build the framework for what we'll discuss in a few minutes, an accommodation is simply a change that helps a student overcome or work around their disability without significantly altering the content that the child learns. Accommodations are practices and procedures in the area of presentation, response, setting, and timing or scheduling that provide equitable access to grade level content for diverse learners. Accommodations are determined by an IEP team and are based on the individual's needs. Exceptionality nor placement determine what accommodations a student receives. Repeating this powerful caution again, decisions are individualized to the student and should not be based on a specific disability category. Before making decisions, an IEP team should have a solid understanding of the test and what the test content, types of questions, and conditions of the test are. They should have knowledge of the state's testing and accommodations guidelines, the student's present level of academic achievement and functional performance, as well as how is the student provided with equal learning opportunities, and what approaches and strategies are given to support the student in overcoming these obstacles. The department's K-3 Literacy Screener Test Coordinator Manual provides information on the use of accommodations and accessibility and Braille for the DIBELS assessment. And some of these features are breaks in sessions, hearing aids, assistive listening devices, glasses, smartwatches, whisper phones, as well as Braille. A hard copy Braille form is available for students with visual impairment who are unable to take the computer-based test, and the form is linked here for easy access. Extended time is an accommodation that's often discussed. The Test Administration Manual provides specific guidance regarding extended time. It reads, for administration of the DIBELS 8th version, free version, extended time is defined as double the time that is prescribed. For example, if all students must complete the subtest in a minute, extended time allows for 2 minutes. The screener sections should all be strictly timed. Extended time is only for the following students: English learners, as identified in the Link 360 enrollment, students with fluency-based speech disorders, which are documented on their IEP, students who are assessed with alternate rubrics, those perhaps with significant cognitive disabilities, and students with limited verbal language skills, as documented on their IEP, and if they're not participating in that alternate assessment, as well as students who require Braille. The extended time accommodation must be included on the IEP, IAP, or L checklist prior to screening administration. For fall, only a 30-day advance rule was not applicable, but for winter, so this December screening and for the spring screenings in April, all accommodations must be added at least 30 days prior to the opening of the screening window. Assessment and accommodations to assessment should be consistent with the primary goal of accurately estimating the child's skills in phonemic awareness, phonics, or alphabetic principle, accuracy and fluency with connected text, reading comprehension, and vocabulary development. Approved accommodations are accommodations that are unlikely to change substantially the meaning or interpretation of scores on the measure, or the targeted skill being assessed by that measure. So considering DIBELS is designed to assess literacy skills, the test read aloud option would substantially subvert the purpose or the construct of that assessment. So the test read aloud option is not permitted. It should be noted that some test administration directions are able to be read aloud, and that is noted in the testing instructions. For statewide assessments, communication assistance is signing or cueing for the test for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, and a test administrator and our interpreter who is fluent in signing or cueing, and the student routinely is cued to by this administrator, should be the one who administers the test to this student. The test should also be signed directly as written, and the students should be tested individually or in a small group. Lastly, an IEP team may discuss special considerations for students who are deaf and hard of hearing in regards to physical settings. Students' auditory listening devices should be in good working condition and used during the testing period. And students who depend primarily on lip reading should be seated no more than 10 feet from the test administrator. The test is to be administered in a student's usual mode of communication. It's also important to ensure the room is well lit with the source of light directed toward the test administrator. That is, the test administrator should avoid standing in front of windows or other sources of bright light, as well as ensuring that the students are watching the test administrator. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Lauren Miley to provide more information and suggestions for including diverse learners on the DIBELS 8th edition screening.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Charlene. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and our team certainly appreciates you taking the time this morning to join us on our webinar. So I want to begin this morning by reviewing some different student populations and how that population can appropriately be assessed as well as accommodated on a literacy screener. So let's begin with our students who are deaf and are hard of hearing. We know that our teachers and speech language pathologists, they are the critical players in ensuring that these learners have equal access to grade level content standards and participate in the required accountability measures. Now, these teachers, they are bringing their specialized skills and knowledge of specific instructional strategies needed by students with hearing loss. And they're also providing those needed accommodations during instruction and assessments. So for the literacy screener, the teacher should first determine if the deaf or hard of hearing student can be assessed using DIBELS. An alternate response mode may be utilized if an IEP team does determine that that standard administration of the DIBELS measurement does not allow the opportunity for a student to provide answers that might reflect their current mastery of literacy skills. So the alternate response mode should be utilized by the student for both instruction and assessment. And of course, that decision will be documented on the student's IEP. Now, some flexible possible administration options, they're outlined on the slide here. And that might include the speech language pathologist or teacher of the deaf or hard of hearing student conducting that screening, as they likely are most familiar with the student's modes of communication, or providing extended time, which would be 2 minutes to complete that DIBELS probe. And then some examples of alternate response modes might include the administrator pointing to each letter on the letter naming fluency subtest, for example, and then the student utilizing ASL, finger spelling, or even visual phonics hand cues. Or for the receptive letter recognition portions of the screener, the examiner could provide the names of the letters from the probe, and then the student points to the correct letter. Now, keep in mind that our department does realize the very special needs of this population, and we want to work closely with all of our school systems to ensure that all of our diverse learner needs are appropriately met. So please email me, reach out to me at lauren.miley@la.gov. Again, that's lauren.miley@la.gov. If your school system has a student with this exceptionality of deaf or hard of hearing, and the DIBELS measurement would not be appropriate for this student based on their exceptionality. So again, please send me an email so we can ensure that we work closely with you to ensure that these students' needs are appropriately met with an appropriate literacy screener. We definitely want to hear from you and discuss how many students might meet this criteria and need an alternate assessment, and then how we can appropriately assess these students' literacy skills using appropriate modes of responses to the assessment items. Okay, so some students on your campus might have characteristics of a nonverbal learning disorder. And we know that this is a neurological condition, and it typically emerges during childhood. Now, keep in mind that these students will not qualify for special services based on the identification only of a nonverbal learning disorder. Rather, these are students that might qualify under the exceptionality of autism, and they are also nonverbal. Or another example that I think some of us are seeing on these campuses might be that these students have characteristics of selective mutism, and it's possible that they are seeing a behavior specialist or even counselor for their individualized needs. So for students who are nonverbal, but they do not qualify for an alternate assessment, be sure to reference the resources that are found on the slide here and determine the most appropriate response modes for these nonverbal learners. Now, we here at the department, we have received a lot of questions regarding this specific population. So it's our hope to clear up any confusion and help support and answer questions for our test administration with these possible response modes for these students. So some possible response modes might include the student finger spelling, using visual phonics hand cues, or pointing to the correct answer instead of verbalizing. And the next population we want to review with you all is a fluency-based speech disorder. So a student who exhibits a fluency-based speech disorder, and that typically means that they have an interruption to their flow of speaking. So think about some students that might be on your campus with a severe stutter, for example. These individuals have speech that doesn't have a typical rate or rhythm, and it's often very difficult to understand due to the repetition of sounds, syllables, words, or even whole phrases. Stuttering is the most common type of fluency disorder, and since oral reading fluency is typically a timed measurement, this type of assessment can be difficult for these students with fluency-based speech disorders. So the speech-language pathologist on your campuses can assist the teachers and help with assessment as well as accommodation decisions. And some possible administration options for these students with fluency-based speech disorders might include that student speech-language pathologist conducting the screening, or even providing extended time, which would be 2 minutes, to complete that DIBELS probe. Our next population of students we want to review today are students with a visual impairment. So students with a visual impairment, they should of course be screened using appropriate modifications, adaptations, and accommodations that have already been documented on the student's IEP. And some common support needs for visually impaired students, they can include assistive technology, large print, and Braille. You can see some possible response modes for these students listed on the slide here. And they might include extended time, which would again be 2 minutes to complete that DIBELS probe. A hard copy Braille form is also available for students with a visual impairment who are unable to take that computer-based test. And you can also see linked here the Braille request form for this particular population. Okay, so let's discuss our English learners. All English learners should be tested, and you can refer to the link bulletin here to read that definition of an English learner. So these learners, they might receive DIBELS approved accommodations if they have been routinely used during the student's classroom instruction and assessments, as well as documented on the L checklist prior to the screening. Now, school systems may determine that the student might require one or more of the following test administration considerations. And that's regardless of the student's status as a student with a disability or as an English learner. And these will be documented on a personal needs profile, PNP, or an accommodations plan. And that includes the time of day, small group or all individual testing, separate or alternative locations, specified area or seating, and then adaptive and specialized equipment or furniture. And then the last population we'll discuss today are our students with a Section 504 plan. So students with 504 plans, they must be provided those accommodations that are based on individual needs, as long as the accommodations do not invalidate the assessment. And those accommodations should be documented in the 504 plan. So if students are designated as both gifted and talented, you would code the primary exceptionality as gifted, and these students may qualify under Section 504, as well as being eligible for accommodations in testing. And students should be coded as special education and as Section 504. And then an IAP must have been completed for the student to receive test accommodations. And then keep in mind that more than one accommodation may be used. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and move into some information regarding the Literacy Alternate Assessment Rubric, or the LAR. So today we will discuss what the LAR is, how to administer this alternate assessment, as well as who is eligible for the LAR. So one element here in Louisiana of setting high expectations of students with disabilities is having all students participate in statewide assessments. So the IEP team should base their assessment participation decisions on how, not if, but how the student will participate. So again, all students includes our diverse learners. So the kindergarten, first, second, and third grade LAR provide an alternate method to DIBELS for assessing literacy skills for Louisiana students with significant cognitive disability. And the LAR is also aligned to our Louisiana connectors. So students who might qualify to participate in the LAR, these again are students with significant cognitive disabilities. That's typically about 1% of the student population that will meet criteria for an alternate assessment participation. So the IEP team will utilize the K-2 alternate assessment decision-making tool, and that's to determine if students in K-2 will meet the criteria for alternate assessments. And then the 3 through 11 alternate assessment criteria will be utilized for those IEP teams for a student in third grade to again determine if that LAR is the appropriate screening tool administered for a literacy screening. So we know that reading, it is the most important academic skill, and it's also the foundation for all learning. And this is especially true for all students, including our diverse learners and including those students with significant cognitive disabilities. So they will still have their literacy skills assessed, but again, it will be done through the LAR. And a student with a significant cognitive disability, that's a student whose disability is significantly impacting their intellectual functioning, and adaptive behaviors. Their instruction is aligned to LEAP Connect alternate standards. And these students are also those that require extensive, repeated, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains with grade level curriculum. So the IEP team will again consider these students for eligibility to participate in an alternate assessment using the criteria that is linked here on the slide for you. Okay, so let's discuss the administration of the LAR. Once a student has been determined eligible for the LAR by those IEP teams using that established eligibility criteria, the test administrator will review the subtests that are found on the LAR. You can see them here. And those subtests also align with what is being tested on DIBELS, as well as the Louisiana connectors for students with significant cognitive disabilities. So again, an example of this first grade rubric, it's found on the slide here, and it begins with the letter naming fluency subtest, which is also again aligning with that first subtest on DIBELS. So the test administrator would determine how to score the student, and that's based on a possible score of 5 total points. And you can see, as indicated on the slide, a score of 1 would mean that the student's letter naming fluency skills are not yet emerging. That student is unable to recognize familiar letters or words. Or maybe the test administrator moves on to a score of 2. That would indicate that the student's skill is emerging. The student is recognizing letters in their name or familiar words or signs. Whereas a score of 3 indicates the student is approaching the target. They are able to distinguish between upper and lowercase letters. A score of 4 on the letter naming fluency skills subtest, that means the student is at target and can perhaps identify familiar letters or words. Whereas a score of 5 indicates that the student could complete this particular portion of DIBELS and perhaps was able to identify some of those letters on the subtest. So then the test administrator would award the student a total score of 5 on the LAR and would indicate how many letters the student was able to identify on that particular subtest. And the amount of letters the student was able to identify is used for that IEP team for progress monitoring purposes to compare to the beginning of the year versus end of the year. Was there any growth for the student's particular letter naming fluency skill? So the test administrator would continue to go through all subtests of the LAR and then determine the appropriate score for that student, which could range between 1 and 5 for each subtest. Now, keep in mind that on the LAR, the test administrator has the ability to use a variety of manipulatives that are appropriate for that particular student. So, for example, on the letter naming fluency subtest, maybe the test administrator is going to use magnetic letter tiles. That might be a favorite for these students with significant cognitive disability. So that particular student likes these letter tiles. That's what the test administrator is going to utilize. That administrator would arrange those letters in front of the student being tested and then determine if the student is able to identify the letters, recognize which letters are lower or uppercase, etc. So again, using different manipulatives to gauge that learner knowledge and to record an appropriate score for the student on the LAR. Okay, so once the LAR subtests have all been administered, the test administrator will then determine the student's scores for each subtest. So we do have the rubric with a possible of 20 possible points. And each subtest had a possible of 5 points for that student. So keep in mind that the scores you can see here on the slide, the scores are not being reported on DIBELS. Again, these are students that have already been identified as eligible for an alternate assessment. So these scores are reported on the LAR only, right? Reported on the LAR only, not on DIBELS. And then the school systems would submit these overall scores to our assessment and accountability team here at LDOE. Okay, I know that was a lot of information, so I want to also leave you here with a previously recorded YouTube video. It does have an overview and some additional information on the law. However, please know that our team is here to support you, answer any questions or concerns you may have. So as you're reviewing eligibility criteria or reviewing the specifics of the law, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me at lauren.miley@la.gov. Again, our team is here to support you as you're navigating these literacy screeners for our diverse learners. Okay, and with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Heron.
Greetings yet again. I'm so excited, you all. So what we have for you are some additional resources that can help with supporting you during this transition. I've also included I've also included the diverse learner support email address in the chat for those who may have additional questions. So what we have are some family tools. These tools are absolutely amazing, and I would encourage you all, now that you have access to the slide deck, to use them. This includes reasons why students with disabilities should take state assessments, and information for families, why testing participation matters to students, and why state testing participation matters to teachers. And then there's also a one-page ready-to-go IEP team discussion guide. On the next slide, you'll see that we also have a student-facing flyer. And while we say this is a student-facing flyer, I would also encourage you to use this tool to support with family communication, as they are a very vital and important stakeholder in the testing process. The next guidance that we have for you all is listed for teachers. Oftentimes, right, we hear teachers say, "Oh, are we doing another assessment?" So this tool can be used to help you answer that question. Yes, we're doing another assessment, and here's why, right? We want to use that growth mindset and say, here's the reason why we're doing this assessment. Here's how this can support you in the classroom. Here's how you can now be engaged with all learners that we have been given the opportunity to teach. The next example is for your IEP teams. As Dr. Miley mentioned earlier, the IEP team is a major component of the testing process. This document can provide guidance on participation with the decision making. So this is a very important document that we would encourage you all to utilize. And lastly, we have a tool that says making statewide testing participation decisions for the IEP team. This is another great resource for the IEP team. Please consider using the resources to support all of your stakeholders impacted by this assessment process, including but not limited to parents, students, and teachers. With that being said, right, I want you all to remember that we want to get your questions. This group has been a little quieter, I dare say, than our last group, who had quite a few questions. So if you have questions from this recording, we are asking that you please put them in the chat, and we'll create an FAQ for you all based on the questions that we get from this webinar. We will also make sure that you all have a copy of this video. It will be emailed out with the questions to the webinar, our FAQ. If there are no other, I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to ask questions. I don't know if this group is just maybe a little bit quieter than our previous group, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We also have our resources for you. These resources will be available on the chat, and they are what we use to create the slide deck presentation. So I see we got one question. Great. So put it in the chat. We're not going to answer it live, but we'll send out an FAQ quite quickly with the responses from you all in the chat. So thank you all so much. We'll give you like another 30 seconds in case there is another question that would need to be put in the chat. And again, if you want access to that FAQ or any responses from this webinar, please put your email address in the chat as well. And if you don't have any more questions, you all are free to exit the Zoom.